Last week when I spoke on Harriet Tubman, I brought up the 1850 fugitive slave law, and somebody sitting here asked if that was the same thing as the Dred Scott. You did.
I did.
And I didn't forget that, and I said it wasn't the same thing. So what I did was I brought my Bible in here.
Oh, very good.
And just to differentiate the two, this is the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and quite bluntly, that if slaves escaping to the north are going to the South Ontario trying to escape this bondage, yeah, if you were a northerner and happened to fall into company with them, you had to return that slave. But this is interesting. The new law added the United States commissioners to the usual courts to issue warrants for the arrest of fugitives and certificates for their removal to states or territories whence they had escaped. Now, get this. Citizens must aid in executing the law. You're obligated. Those harboring, concealing, or rescuing a fugitive were liable to a fine of $1,000. Keep in mind, this is 1850. This is not 1950. 6 months imprisonment and 6 months imprisonment and civil damages of $1,000 for each runaway so lost. That's if you're assisting them. That's pretty steep. Talk about throwing the South a bone here. Big bone. And also, you might be sued for the value of the slave. It's property. Remember, they're not people, they're property. The new law produced an era of slave hunting and kidnapping in the North. So you can appreciate the tenuous position that Harriet Tubman was in, helping these slaves escape. The North drove hundreds of slaves to Canada, created vigilance committees, and increased the underground railroad operations and helped stimulate Mrs. Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, the Dred Scott decision? Yeah. The court held, this is on March 6, 1857, so it's 7 years later. The court held that a Negro slave under the laws of Missouri had no constitutional right to sue in a federal court. When the Constitution was adopted, Negroes were regarded as persons of an inferior order and not as, and it's in quotes here, citizens. And they were not intended to be included by the constitutional provision giving to citizens of different states the right to sue in federal courts. Now, what does it have to do with Susan B. Anthony? She was an abolitionist. In fact, in 1861, there's a notation in her diary that she was working with the Underground Railroad too. And in 1861 entry in her diary, she notes that she was helping to move a slave with the assistance of Harriet Tubman. And like Harriet Tubman, Susan B. Anthony will become friends with Frederick Douglass. Boy, talk about bringing two worlds together here. But Susan B. Anthony herself is actually born in Adams, Massachusetts. Her father is Daniel Anthony, and her mother is Lucy Reed Anthony. Her father is a Quaker. Her mother is not. But her mother will see to it that the children are brought up with Quaker precepts here. And Susan B. Anthony is the second of 7 children. They are all brought up to be self-sufficient. They're all given chores at a young age to organize the kids. And they're brought up in an atmosphere of pursuing social activism. Their father, Daniel Anthony, is very much the ardent abolitionist. Now, this is going to put him at odds with some Quakers. Now, Quakers generally weren't in favor of slavery anyway, but at the same time here, he's very ardent about it. But what puts him on the outs with his Quaker congregation is that he married a non-Quaker. Lucy Reed. Fascinating. But again, they bring up their children in a Quaker atmosphere, but it's also impressed upon them that you need to be a social activist, and you need to understand, and also with business precepts, organization, and get used to hard work, hence the chores. They will move from Adams, Massachusetts to Battenville, New York. And here, Mr. Anthony will be given the job of managing a cotton mill. This was not foreign to him. He had managed another cotton mill anyway. Here at this point, they join another Quaker congregation. And the cycle repeats itself. They are going to be ostracized in part from their congregation. Again, Mr. Anthony is very much the adamant abolitionist, anti-slave, but at the same time here, he's not married to a Quaker. He's married to a non-Quaker. That exists. And keep in mind, at one point here, by the time Susan B. Anthony is 17, she will be sent to a Quaker boarding school in Philadelphia. And she will be there a year. Keep in mind the year 1837, the financial panic that exists in 1837. The family almost goes broke. Family almost goes broke. They will be rescued by an uncle on her mother's side who has a few bucks. And he makes sure the family stays afloat. However, by and it's interesting too, because of the financial distress in the family, she leaves that boarding school. And she's glad of that because she didn't like the oppressive atmosphere. And so by 1845, due to Mr. Anthony, Daniel Anthony's mother dying, and they're left with a few bucks, they will move from Battenville, New York, to just outside Rochester. This is 1845. They have a farm. And again, gee, this starts a trend here. Quaker congregation. And again, Mr. Anthony will be on the outs with the Quaker congregation. However, something different happens here. They begin something called congregational friends. And they begin to hold meetings at the Anthony farm on Sunday afternoons. And they are getting maybe some disgruntled Quakers, social activists, people who are concerned about what's going on in the country, and they all convene here on Sunday afternoons at the Anthony farm. And one of the people who shows up, and she will become a lifelong friend of this person, is Frederick Douglass. Interesting here. In 1846, Susan B. Anthony will wind up at the Congregational Academy. She is the head mistress of the female students there. But at the same time, she's developing this attitude towards social activism. 1848, while she's still at the Congregational Academy here, the Seneca Women's Rights Convention is convened, followed 2 weeks later by another women's rights convention in Rochester, New York. Now, her father, her mother, her sister Mary will attend that second convention. And they will sign a declaration of sentiments for pushing women's rights. Now, Susan B. Anthony's not here. She's at the Congregational Academy here. And so Mary is interesting. Her sister Mary, by the way, will later become a principal of a Rochester high school and a known women's rights activist. In fact, in the 1850s, two of her brothers, Daniel Jr. and Merritt, will go to Kansas. And Daniel will wind up being a newspaper journalist, and he will actually own a newspaper and later become the mayor of Leavenworth. Merritt, by the way, will take his father's ardent belief in anti-slave and join John Brown's group. And they say Quakers don't have guts? You gotta be kidding. You got to be kidding here. And so Susan B. Anthony, the Congregational Academy closes down. And she goes back home. And she's going to help manage her father's farm. Her father's branching out here. He's organizing an insurance company, so Susan will help run the farm, and Daniel will actually start his insurance company. But at the same time here, she attends the Daughters of Temperance meeting in New York. Now keep in mind, social activism includes the temperance movement, because this directly affects women. The plight of women here is accentuated by what? Alcoholism with husbands? Keep in mind the times. Women in many states, even when they had a job, if they got paid, had to turn their pay over to their husbands. If a woman could get a divorce from an abusive or alcoholic husband, in many of these states, even after the divorce, the husband keeps the kids. Yeah, it's not a very good situation here. And then the more you read into this, the more you see why people like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, another one here, Lucy Stone, and they're all going to come together here. Now keep in mind, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was one of those who organized the Seneca Falls Convention. She, in 1851, will meet Susan B. Anthony, and the two hit it off right away. And as the two formed this partnership, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was considered the more intellectual of the two. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton will say, I might have written the Thunderbolts, but Susan B. Anthony shot them off. Yes?
Isn't one of the Quaker values pacifism?
That was supposed to be one of them, I guess.
Because obviously, Mrs. might have had a very large influence on Mr. because one does not go and join John Brown's group.
Well, her son did.
Yeah.
Her son did.
But they're trying to assimilate these values, and yet they're...
But keep in mind, too, when these kids leave the flock, well, kids, they're young adults at this point. Keep in mind, in 1846, when Susan B. Anthony was teaching at the Congregational Academy, you begin to see a change here in this lady. She's dropping thee and thou from her speech, and now all of a sudden she's wearing more stylish dresses. In fact, it's in 1849 when she gives her first real public talk at the Daughters of Temperance meeting that she begins to understand the power of speech. And this lady is going to make a living as a speaker. And she will, by the way, do 75 to 100 talks a year. Now keep in mind what kind of a feat this is. Last year in this state, I gave 206 talks. But I have a car. The state has provided the highways. Go back to 1849, 1855, 1860s. You got 95 out here? You don't even have a car. What do you have? Horse and buggy. And picture her doing this in the winters in New York. That's a feat. And she's able to, get this, able to live on the speaking fees after a while. In fact, to the point where as this lady's name becomes known, she's making what? More money. The notoriety or popularity. And she's able to help not only serve herself, but put money into the movement. The spoken word. And yet she will later say, one of the biggest impediments for women to advance their rights is to be denied the privilege or the right to express their opinion in public. And you see this in 1852 when she attends a temperance convention for the state of New York. Now she's used to speaking. However, she wants to speak at this convention. Guess what she's told? Women are here to listen and learn and not speak. Oh, well, that's not going to fly. That's not going to fly. Guess what she does? She gets up, and other women follow her. And out the door they go. She will help form, with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the Women's State Temperance Alliance or Association. Elizabeth Cady Stanton will be the president of this, and Susan B. Anthony will be a high-ranking agent. And again, now you see the amalgamation of the two together. Now keep in mind how this is important. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's married. Susan B. Anthony will never marry. Now keep in mind how important this is. And this is a cornerstone of her success. Women back then, many times, they couldn't sign a contract. The husband had to sign for them. And go back to what I mentioned about the money. It'd be hard-pressed for women to own property. Forget the money, property. And what is it John Adams said? For a functioning system of representative government, the wide ownership of property is essential. Well, when you're ostracizing, let's say round numbers, half your population from owning property, how democratic are you? Calls that into question. Calls that into question here. And so this and the importance of Susan B. Anthony not being married, and as the movement snowballs here, she has no husband to sign a contract for her. She can. She can arrange contracts for the movement. She can be paid. She doesn't have to turn her money over to a husband, and she can do what she wants with that money. Is that a cornerstone for success in this era? Yes. That's a big one. But with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her husband moved from Rochester in 1851 and moved to New York City. Susan B. Anthony goes with them. Now keep in mind the situation here. Elizabeth Cady Stanton has about 7 kids.
She lived in my building.
And, beg your pardon?
Lived where I lived. It's called Elizabeth Cady Stanton House.
Ah! And so, you know... Oh, really? And so you see here, this amalgamation strengthened here because Susan B. Anthony moves with them. And Mr. Stanton's okay with this. He's okay with this. And so while Elizabeth Cady Stanton is busy writing, or maybe even going out to give a talk, who sometimes watches the kids? Susan B. Anthony. And then vice versa. It works. It works. But at the same time, Susan B. Anthony is also as a teacher, involved in going to conventions or meetings in New York State with regards to teachers. Interesting what she does here in speaks at New York State Teachers Convention, 1853. Again, being used to speak, she wants to address the convention. The convention has to take a half hour to debate whether it's all right for women to talk in public. She's finally accorded the so-called right to speak. This is what she says. I find this interesting. Anthony will say, "Do you not see that so long as society says a woman is incompetent," get this, incompetent to be a lawyer, a minister, or doctor, but has ample ability to be a teacher, that every man of you who chooses this profession tacitly acknowledges that he has no more brains than a woman. That's what she says. Yeah. And so, in fact, she's for equal rights. Not just women, equal rights. And this again is going to form that split between her and Elizabeth Cady Stanton with that other group of women's writers, Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe. This is later on, this is coming. Because keep in mind, since women have a tough time getting money to push the woman's agenda, they have to put their lot with the abolitionist movement. Keep in mind, who are many of the popular abolitionists? Men. Is it easier for men to get money? Yes. And so they will throw their lot with William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, people like this, and the editor Horace Greeley. It's fine in the beginning, but you're going to see this split as we get closer to blacks being able to, black men, let's understand that, black men getting the right to vote. And that's going to cause a split here. And it's going to cause a split in the women's movement here. But again, she's also, again, for equal rights. And she's not only, her and Stanton the same thing. We want women to have the right to vote and have rights, but what about the black man? She pushes in the New York education system the idea, and going to these meetings, that blacks should have the right to education and college. And at one convention, that's denied because this is not a proper topic for discussion. Yeah. She also tries to put forth a resolution at the convention that women be accorded the same educational opportunities as men. Oh, I can't have that either. In fact, one of the rebuttals is, one opponent to this at the convention states, it is a vast social evil, the first step in the school which seeks to abolish marriage, and behind this picture I see a monster of social deformity. Sounds like a Taliban meeting. The New York State Judiciary Committee. Interesting. As her and Elizabeth Cady Stanton begin to, get this movement jump-started, even in the 1850s, they try to get the state to outlaw alcohol. Well, you know where that went. That didn't work. That didn't work. But what happened with the Volstead Act? Remember that one in 1920? Was it 20 or 21? Where they outlawed alcohol? And what happened with that? Bugs Moran, Al Capone, Johnny Torrio. Yeah, that worked well. Dutch Schultz. You know what Dutch Schultz's real name was?
Arthur Flegenheimer.
Arthur Flegenheimer, yes. Yeah.
See why you changed it?
You're going to go a lot farther in a pinstripe suit and a Tommy gun with Dutch Schultz than you are with Arthur Flegenheimer. I mean, Arthur Flegenheimer sounds like the name of a guy who sold those gangsters the Spats.
Joe Kennedy.
Well, that's a higher level, I guess. Actually, Dutch Schultz had a home in Norwalk for a while. Right on the harbor. Interesting. Fascinating. She, by the way, her and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were pushing the idea of, again, going back to the temperance issue here. Abolishing alcohol. That's going to go no place. That's going to go no place. But keep in mind what they are able to do. After a while, they do achieve some sort of legislative success. And get this one. In 1860, the New York State Legislature passed the Improved Married Woman's Property Act that gave married women the right to own separate property. That's a big one. Enter into contracts and be joint guardian of the children. Those are big steps to take in 1860. However, keep in mind what happens here. This is 1860. 1861, the war starts. And what do you think happened to some of those advancements for women? With attention focused on the war, some of them get rolled back. But it's still a step. You took 2 steps forward, you'll take 1 step back here. Interesting what's going on here. Anti-slavery activities. Susan B. Anthony had been in anti-slavery activities since she was 16, 17. Trying to collect petitions as a teenager to outlaw slavery. In 1856, she will be the New York State agent for the American Anti-Slave Association. But she makes it apparent here, and she impresses the case that yes, She's anti-slave, but she's also moving into that women's rights movement, suffrage. But she also believes that not only should women have the right to vote, but the black man and black woman. Interesting how ahead of her time, well, maybe not all that ahead of her time, but one of the big boosters of this. Interesting here. Interesting. She's also against, by the way, this idea of not only, equal rights, but after the abolition of slavery, sending blacks back to Africa. That's prevalent at this time in 1860-61. And Abraham Lincoln was not really on board with, destroying slavery in 1860 or 62. In fact, I have a quote at home. He was more interested in putting the country together. But keep in mind, in 1861, 1862, is the war going that well for the North at this point? Oh, it's not. It's virtually a stalemate at this point. And so what's going to happen here? Emancipation of blacks. 1863. Now, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony helped form what's known as the Women's Loyal National League. Considering that the war is on, this effort is to abolish slavery. And keep in mind the North. There's about 23 million people up north, 9 million down south, over 3.9 million of them are black. So the white manpower pool is not very good down south as it is up north. But to push the idea of an amendment to the Constitution to abolish slavery, Susan B. Anthony organizes a petition effort. She gets 5,000 women, and they take to the field. This is the most successful effort at a petition for an issue in American history up to this point. They will get 400,000 signatures. It's estimated that 1 of every 24 Americans in the North signed this petition. Hard work here, considering, again, no automobiles, there's no modern roads, doing this on horseback or by wagon. 400,000 signatures on these petitions. This helps to push what's going to happen in 1865, the amendment to abolish slavery. Now, I'm going to read this amendment to you, because in my mind, this really doesn't abolish slavery. The 13th Amendment, ratified 1865. Section 1, it's short, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for, get this, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted shall exist within the United States. Does that sound like slavery was abolished? Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Section 2, the Congress shall have the power to enforce this article. Apparently somebody found a loophole here back in the early 80s, and this is going to lead to privatized prisons. Interesting what you see here. In fact, companies like Victoria's Secrets, Walmart, Kmart, AT&T, Nordstrom's, and so on and so forth, indulge in privatized prisoners. And these people are paid anywhere from 17 cents an hour to $1.25 an hour, depending on the state. So again, you have to ask the question, was slavery or indentured servitude abolished? Some constitutionalists say yes, some constitutionalists say no. But apparently the effort to privatize some aspects of the American prison system have succeeded. In fact, Jeff Sessions wants to accentuate that. Interesting what you see here. It's only fascinating. But the Women's Loyal National League is emblematic of one big thing here. Susan B. Anthony, with this petition effort, impresses upon women, keep in mind, 5,000 of them go to the field to get these petitions signed, that women do not have the right to vote, but they can get petitions done. What a political effort this is. Organizing? Organizing. Fascinating here. The Equal Rights Association, the American Equal Rights Association. This is formed to push the agenda of equal rights following the war. At this point, Susan B. Anthony in 1865 is actually out in Kansas helping her brother with her newspaper. But the idea of an amendment abolishing slavery, and then later for black men voting, Elizabeth Cady Stanton contacts her, sends her a message. We think that the word male, for black men is going to be put into an amendment of the Constitution to get them to vote. Male voting. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton's concern is, once they stick the word male in an amendment, that will solidify male voting, and she says it'll take us a century to get it out of the Constitution. I need you, come on back. And Susan B. Anthony will. And they will help form the American Equal Rights Association. And again, Lucy Stone's involved in this, but here again you're going to see the split here. The American Equal Rights Association with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony are for rights for, rights for everybody. It makes no difference, man, woman, black, white. The abolitionists who help support this and help fund this are beginning to have second thoughts here. Wendell Phillips, Horace Greeley, no! Back off on the agenda of women's rights. Let's get the black man to have his right to vote. Then we'll tackle the women's issue. Lucy Stone is in favor of this. Lucy Stone is in favor of this. Although she's an ardent women's writer, she's in favor of this. Susan B. Anthony? No. No. And neither is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And so in Kansas, when they try to get past women's rights with regards to black rights, Wendell Phillips will help strike this from the so-called convention that they have in Kansas. In fact, he wants to withhold abolitionist funds for the women's movement. And that's going to starve the American Equal Rights Association for money. They're tied to the abolitionist agenda. Again, because of the lack of money that women have. A lot of this is follow the money. That's with a lot of things that man does. Follow the money. When you follow the money trail with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, where does some of this wind up? Saudi Arabia, the Wahhab school. It's the same sort of thing here. And so, yes?
What is the level of education for the general population, male, female,
In the United States?
at that time?
Well, you have a number of people going to colleges. Of course, keep in mind, too, when you go back to the colonial era up to this point, and as the country, and keep in mind the modernization going on. We're at 1865, the 1870 period, the industrialization that's going on here. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are cognizant of that because they're going to join the National Labor Union in 1866. Now that the country is really industrializing, this so-called social conscience for economic issues is very much rising to the fore here. In fact, the National Labor Union is actually for farmers, workers, women, and Negroes. And the idea here is to amalgamate all these factions to offset the large landowners, the growing clique of bankers, and politicians that adhere to this agenda. plus the growing clique of business. Keep in mind what you saw here in 1865. There were 144,000 factories in this country. Now, granted, they're not huge, huge factories for the most part. But by 1900, 335,000. Does that change the women's movement? It sure does, because now there's more what? Economic opportunities as we industrialize here. And the economy's getting more sophisticated. What does that mean? You need more people to take part. So should this open up more opportunities for women? Yeah, Susan B. Anthony understands this one very well. Yes?
The question about the general educational level, it used to be that graduating from high school was a very big deal.
It used to be. Right.
And there was no financial aid to go to college.
No, but keep in mind at this
So
point...
if you didn't have money, it was very difficult to go to college.
Right, but keep in mind at this point, in answer to this question, when you go back to the colonial era of America, like in Europe, Western Europe, not so much Eastern Europe, Western Europe, being involved with Greek, Latin classics, music, the growing aspect, the growing importance of science, well-rounded individuals. You had people going to college at age 14. Of course, again, society's different. But well-rounded individuals who were extremely intelligent, like Thomas Jefferson, Madison, people like this, Franklin, people like, along those lines, really intelligent people for their time. And yeah, so you're seeing education become more important here to the betterment of the country. And so more people are being educated.
It was the GI Bill that really educated the country.
Well, after 1945, yeah, that was the debt the country owed those guys for going, and women who went. This country owed that to them. And that's a debt they're going to pay. Well, why not? It's going to help the country after the war is over with. I mean, it's not hard to figure that one out. Yes?
But Mark, from the colonial period through Reconstruction, I mean, when you took a look at the educational opportunities in the North, they were very, very different than the educational opportunities in the South.
Oh, yeah.
For men and definitely for women.
Right.
The roles were so solidified for women in the South, but very, very different in the North, where there was a more liberal frame of mind.
Well, the North is where the industrialization is taking place. And so the North will be economically in a more advantageous position. And so most of those factories are going to be where?
In the North.
Most of the banks, most of the banking interests are where? Most of the people are where?
In the North.
Most of the shipping interests are where?
In the North.
So you think the South had a chance to win that war? No. No. They didn't have a chance. They were done. They were cooked. But the fact of the matter is, with the women's movement here, you are seeing a split. Again, Stanton and Anthony want to see a broad brush rights for not only men and women, but also the black. Rights to go to school, rights to get a job, rights to make money, right to maybe vote. Not just the black man, women too. But again, because of the fact that the abolitionists are going to starve the American Equal Rights Association of funds, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony will turn to a man by the name of George Francis Train. George Francis Train is a man with a lot of money. He was also critical of the Republican Party at the time. However, he carries baggage in that he always questioned the mental capacity of blacks. But Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton think they can change his mind. But they need the money. They need the money for this. At the same time, joining the National Labor League, they're trying to tie the woman's agenda to the growing power of labor. However, they are going to get the boot out of the National Labor Union when in 1869 there was a printer's strike. Susan B. Anthony thinks, well, this is the right time for women to be trained as printers and get jobs. And what do you think the union says? You're strike busters. Out. At the same time, they start a newspaper known as, in 1869, the revolution. The paper is to get women that platform to be able to write and express their opinions. They're also for labor. They're also for the freedom of blacks. And George Francis Train is going to supply some of the funding here for this. However, George Francis Train goes to England. He gets involved with the Irish movement to free themselves from British rule. He will wind up in jail, and so that gravy train of money runs out, and by 1871, the paper is going to close. The paper will close. But again, you are seeing here, though, this split in the women's movement. This is all going on at the same time here. And so Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony will form what's known as the National Women's Suffrage Association, and Lucy Stone and somebody like a Julia Ward Howe will help form the American Women's Suffrage Association. And this goes to a bitter split. Again, Susan B. Anthony and Stanton believe in a broad brush approach to rights. They also believe that we should take this across the entire nation. And on top of that, they do not want to be beholden to any political party. They feel this will stifle their agenda. As opposed to Lucy Stone, who believes that the women's agenda cannot be helped unless we affiliate ourselves with the Republican Party. She also thinks that yes, that perhaps the black man should get the right to vote, and then we, with the help of the abolitionists and the Republican Party, push the woman's agenda. That's not how Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton see this. And so now there's a split in the movement. However, by the 1870s, Susan B. Anthony has reached that level where she is now a sought-after speaker. She's one of the most sought-after speakers in the entire country. And yes, she's up to 75, 100 talks a year, but her level of comfort, and I'm not talking about her being rich. I'm talking about the fact that there are people latching onto this of importance. Jane Stanford comes to mind here. She is the wife of a railroad owner who will provide, when it's necessary, a private car for Susan B. Anthony as she's taking trips to give talks. The Riggs Hotel in Washington, D.C., when Susan B. Anthony shows up for a convention or a talk in Washington, D.C., will give her a suite or a group of rooms for a convention, tab-free. Yeah. Interesting how this lady is becoming extremely important here, politically. And that's really what's important here, politically. However, she's going to take that next step and push the idea of women voting. What do we want to wait for Congress for? What do you want to do that for? Let's push the agenda. And in 1872 in New York, women will try to vote. One of the leaders here is Susan B. Anthony. Her and 50 other women in Rochester and in and around Rochester will try to go to the polls and vote for president in the 1872 election. And many will be turned away by the polling bosses here, but some will be allowed to vote. Not that their votes are going to count, but they're allowed to vote. However, warrants for arrest go out. 15 women are to be arrested. 14 will be let go. Anyone want to take a guess as to who's the one that's not let go? Susan B. Anthony. That's okay. She's going to take this. She's going to take this where she needs to take it. She's supposed to be arraigned in federal court in Monroe County, New York, which is where Rochester is anyway. She knows this. What does she do? She gets on the horse and buggy and she goes to every city and town and village, 29 of them in Monroe County, giving speeches on women's rights and constitutional rights. Well, the authorities understand that maybe Monroe County has now been poisoned. And so now they've moved the trial to neighboring Ontario County. Oh, that's no problem. Susan B. Anthony gets on the horse and wagon again, and she goes to every village, town, and city in Ontario County, giving the same speech. There is a federal circuit judge by the name of Ward Hunt that's picked to oversee the trial in June of 1873. Now, he's an interesting character. He's never presided over a jury trial. Never did. He's a circuit judge. He was a politician, and he's also been nominated for the Supreme Court. But supposedly here, and this is interesting. I find this fascinating. And I have this highlighted here. This is how the trial is going to go. Following a rule of common law at the time which prevented criminal defendants in federal courts from testifying, Judge Hunt refused to allow Anthony to speak until the verdict was delivered. On the second day of the trial, get this, on the second day of the trial, after both sides presented their cases, Justice Hunt delivered his opinion, which he put in writing. The most controversial aspect of the trial, Hunt directed the jury to deliver a guilty verdict. Now, it would seem the deck is stacked against Susan B. Anthony here. It's on the third day that Hunt finally gives Susan B. Anthony her due. Now, you can say a few words. As she begins to speak, Hunt now begins to understand where this is going. He repeatedly tells her to be quiet and sit down. Well, that's not going to work. She doesn't. She keeps talking. And here's a little bit of what she says, talking about this trial. This high-handed outrage upon my citizens' rights. You have trampled under every foot every vital principle of our government. My natural rights, my civil rights, my political rights, my judicial rights are all ignored. Judge Hunt fines her $100, which she says, I'm not paying $1. She says that. And then she says, I am not paying $1 of your unjust penalty. That's what she says. If Hunt's going to order her imprisoned, she says she will take this to the Supreme Court. Guess what happens here? She doesn't pay the fine, and she's let go. I mean, she's a personality. You don't think some of the journalists didn't pick this up? In fact, in the New York Times, I think it was the New York Times, one of the New York newspapers, they note when this first starts that the defendant in this case, and they highlight it, is a woman. They're accentuating this situation, and it helps Susan B. Anthony here. When the idea of her taking this to the Supreme Court, keep in mind Ward Hunt has been nominated for the Supreme Court. He can't have that. His chance of getting the Supreme Court is out. And so the U.S. Supreme Court in 1875, to head off Susan B. Anthony, to put an end to the strategy of trying to achieve women's suffrage through the court system, in a ruling known as Minor versus Haberstadt, and it says in quotes, the Constitution of the United States does not confer the right of suffrage on anyone. But the damage is already done. More and more, it's going to be a long time yet, till 1920, but more people are gravitating toward this idea of women not only having the right to vote, but maybe equality under the law? 1920, right. And so we're 25 years away from that, 45 years away from that at this point. But you have to admit, women have made strides here. the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association, these virtually fall apart by 1890, but they will come together to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And for the first 2 years of this effort, Elizabeth Cady Stanton is the president, but by 1892, Susan B. Anthony is the president. 1883, actually, she and Elizabeth Cady Stanton go to Europe. If they're making inroads here, then why not join hands with your comrades in Europe? There is a suffrage movement going on in Europe. Britain, France, so on and so forth. And it's here that they make those contacts necessary to put together what's going to be known as the International Council of Women, which is now affiliated with the United Nations. And in 1888 is their first convention in Washington, D.C. And they will have a second convention at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. They will have another convention in 1899 in Britain. Their fourth convention will occur in Berlin in 1904. And Susan B. Anthony, by this point, is a celebrity. She's an absolute celebrity. However, she will die in 1906 at the age of 86 in Rochester, New York. Heart failure, pneumonia will kill her. But you have to admit one thing here. Come hell or high water, she bears a large responsibility for women 14 years later getting the right to vote. She's not the only one, obviously, here. Interesting, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton died, 1901, that really struck Susan B. Anthony hard. It was like her alter ego, a sister, who was passed. They were together for 50 years, working for this agenda. That's called commitment. And I want to end up by reading one more thing here. And this really struck me here. Susan B. Anthony saying, talk about activism. And she writes this in 1860. Oh yeah, her and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and several others in the 1880s, 1881 to 1886, will write a 6-volume set on the history of the women's movement up to that point. 6 volumes. Took them 5 years to do this. 5,700 words it supposedly is. Anyway, cautious, careful people, always casting about to preserve their reputation and social standing, never can bring about a reform. Those who are really in earnest must be willing to be anything or nothing in the world's estimation, and publicly and privately, in season or out, avow their sympathy with despised and persecuted ideas and their advocates, and bear the consequences. That's a pretty strong statement about being an activist. Or being a patriot, perhaps, too? Depending on your point of view. Interesting character. Yes?
Mark, in the 1960s, when the National Organization of Women really picked up its steam with Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan and others, how much credit, the agenda obviously is different, the times were different, but how much credit did they give to the forebearers like Susan B. Anthony? Because basically, these women that you discussed today, they formed the infrastructure, and everything else was built upon it.
Oh, yeah.
Between World War I and World War II, there really wasn't very, very much, but certainly in the 50s and 60s, it started all over again. Was there any mention ever made of their predecessors or did they just feel that, well, it's a new chapter?
Well, women like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Harriet Tubman, Lucy Stone, Lucretia Mott, people like this, they're that foundation of this house that's going to be built. And then you get, before the end of the 19th century is over with, people like Helen Keller, Eleanor Roosevelt, to help carry that torch further after people like Stanton and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony are gone, and also Amelia Earhart. And so they're building off what came before them. And so you will see, again, people like Helen Keller, Amelia Earhart, and Roosevelt helping to carry that torch further. Like Amelia Earhart into something that was considered a male-dominated endeavor, flight. I mean, there were other women besides Amelia Earhart involved in flight. Helen Keller, who, and they leave this out when they really talk about her many times, she was an ardent socialist. She was an ardent pacifist. She didn't like Woodrow Wilson, and she was good friends with people like Mark Twain, who was an ardent opponent of the Spanish-American War. And so, and so you see people like Amelia Earhart, Keller, and Eleanor Roosevelt around the same time going in different directions, but again, raising the stature of women here. And so, when you get to the and then what happened in the 1950s? Rosa Parks, just one example. Lena Horne, ardent social activist. And so you will again see the Gloria Steinems and so on and so forth coming on. And they come in waves here. They come in waves. But I mean, there's a lot of women that are part of this succession of waves that come along to improve a lot of women. I mean, of course, what really helps women, not taking it away from these individuals, World War I and World War II, because you're seeing industrialized, commercialized war. And because of the factory system, which is part of it, capitalism, we now need more men to fight. We can't rely on professional soldiers and volunteers anymore. We need to conscript the entire population. Well, part of that conscription of the entire population is if the men aren't riveting the planes together, who's going to have to do that? Women. And especially after World War II. It's kind of late in 1945 to say, sorry, ladies, the deal is off, back to the kitchen. It's kind of hard to say that. And so while many women, yes, became housewives, I know my mother was one after the war, the fact of the matter is, the die is cast. Society has changed, and irrevocably so. And so, yes, it comes in waves. Yes?
I'm just wondering, the Equal Rights Amendment hasn't fully passed yet.
No, and you know who backed that? Big time? Amelia Earhart, and I'll get into that last week. But she was a big proponent of that.
But still, I mean, how many years has this been? It's just pretty incredible.
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh.
How many states are holding out?
I think only one.
I forgot how many states are holding out here.
Only one I've heard.
Only one?
That's what I've heard. Which one? But I haven't read that.
Must be a red state.
To check it.
We should check it.
Yeah, that's a good idea to check how many states are holding out.
There are a lot of them.
But yeah, I mean, that's part of this struggle. I mean, let's face it, in some endeavors, they're still male-dominated. But then again, you have to raise the question here that male dominance on certain things. When you're going to solve problems, why would you ostracize women? So you cut your brain power in half to solve problems? Why would you do that for?
Because that's stupid.
Well, yeah, but let's face it, there's also an agenda here. There's also an agenda here. I mean, even with the Islamic religion, I mean, if you read the Quran, women are accorded a portion of an inheritance.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you honestly think on a good day the Taliban's going to observe that? Or the Islamic State? And I'm sure you have friends who like to cherry pick what they're going to observe in their religion and what they're not going to observe. People are people no matter who they are. Men, women, black, white, whatever, young, old. I mean, you know this. You know this. So,
Putting it in writing is one thing.
beg your pardon?
Putting something into writing is one thing. Carrying it out
Is something else, right? Right. But you got to admit one thing. This lady helped carry it out, and she wasn't going to be denied. Again, go back to that quote. She wasn't going to be, and even if you're unpopular for the moment, okay, I'm still wedded to the agenda. I'm wedded to the agenda. Now, you got to give somebody like that a lot of credit. You know, you hear this every so often. Well, this isn't going to work, so why bother? But then again, I always go back to Vince Lombardi, who once said, "We will never achieve perfection, but you should strive for it anyway." Interesting comment. Yes?
I just finished reading a diary, 1859 diary, written by a Quaker in Wilmington and Baltimore. And you said her daughter actually married a Catholic, a German Catholic.
Oh boy.
And there was no ruction in the family. There was no mention of this. They remained close friends. They remained a close family. And I'm wondering whether there were Quakers and Quakers, because there was, nobody blinked.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Sometimes, but sometimes a mixture like that is volatile.
No.
Interesting.
The diarist, which was the mother of the daughter,
Right.
her husband died very early on, and
Right.
she lived with all these kids, one after another, somewhere between Wilmington and Baltimore, depending on where she was going in each time.
Yeah.
No, it made no particular difference in the sort of the humor.
Yeah.
The whole thing is the Mary then learns German, appears to have taken on the Catholic religion, and then eventually that group leaves the Catholic religion because the Catholic religion is asking for too much money, which is sort of not something the Quaker would do. This is a significant Quaker family. There are records of this family at Swarthmore.
That's interesting. That's interesting. But again, you know, some people will go with that. Some people won't.
That's true.
You know.
You can't argue that. And it's just one person.
Right.
Her diary.
Yeah, but where there's one, there's another. You know, you just can't say that, well, this religion will ostracize people altogether. But then there's the individuals in these religions that don't agree with that. Again, going back to what I just mentioned, you know people who will cherry pick what they want to observe in their religion.
Well, this lady was pretty, I mean, she was going to the higher up meetings within the group meetings. So
Right.
we have this small unit. She would go to the Quaker church twice a day.
Right.
And then she'd go to the area meeting and the bigger area meeting
Yeah.
and so on. She was quite involved.
Interesting. Yes, ma'am.
So when did the women get the right to have property here? After 1868?
Well, women had the right to own property in New York in 1860. But Connecticut? That's a good question. That's a good question to look up. Because each state's going to be different anyway. It's going to be different anyway. But that's a good question. That's a good question. But it was 1860, helped by, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Where women, but again, there are still impediments here. But because Susan B. Anthony wasn't married, she was able to sign contracts where women. In fact, in one of these petitions, they were trying to push the woman's agenda in the 1850s. That Susan B. Anthony made sure that when the petition was signed, it was the woman that signed the petition and not the husband who signed it for her. Because what good is it if you're pushing women's rights and the husband's going to sign the petition for his wife? No. Even if I have to get less signatures but have a woman sign, then it's worth it. I mean, if you're going with volume and the husband's going to sign for the wife, well, what have you accomplished here? Nothing. So yes.
Just to answer the question about the ERA, it had until 1977 to be ratified. Only 35 states have ratified it.
35 states?
35 or 38. 38, something like that. And then that's when Phyllis Shapley got, I think 38 needed to ratify it, 35
Right.
had ratified it. It was going in that direction. That's when Phyllis Shapley got really involved with her campaign. So then 4 states tried to pull out of it, but it didn't reach the deadline by 1977.
Right.
That was later extended to 1982, but nobody moved on it, so.
Yeah.
So it's gone by the boards unless,
The shelf life ran out.
yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Yes.
It's very recent that banks would not consider the wife's earnings when evaluating a couple to buy a house to get a mortgage.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, yet we're a two-income society. You know?
That's out the window now.
Right.
But,
Well, yeah, for many of these bankers, the dollar's as big as a bedspread anyway.
but it wasn't that long ago the banks were able to get away with that.
Right, right.
But it's not only banks, it's social organizations. There are some country clubs that once a couple is divorced,
Right.
widowed, she loses her membership.
Right.
That's really been a big deal in some places in Fairfield County.
Yeah, well, yeah, but again, that goes back to the 19th century too, when a woman could get a divorce from her husband but couldn't get control of the children. She couldn't get control of the property.
But there are still some religions today and different parts of that religion that still have those beliefs.
Well, yeah, but then again, how hard have the people of that religion pushed to get it changed? That could be an issue too. Yeah, I'm not going to go into the religions that do that because that starts a whole ball of wax here. But you know what I mean. But it's interesting how again these ladies like this. And next week I'm going to talk about Helen Keller, who's a really fascinating. Well, they're all fascinating in their own way.
So
But
it's Helen Keller and then,
Amelia Earhart. Yeah, and then comes the Russian Revolution.
I think it's Eleanor Roosevelt.
I already spoke on Eleanor Roosevelt here, so when they were divining this, she was a standalone. She was a standalone.
Helen Keller.
Right. But I find that when I talk about these women, guess who draws the biggest crowd? Eleanor Roosevelt, it seems. And I noticed too that when I'm going around the state talking about different people, whether they're men or women, Eleanor usually draws the biggest crowd, but you know who's moved up to number 2? Vladimir Putin. Wow is right. He's topical. And so, but Eleanor probably still takes the cake. Not even, I talked on Winston Churchill, he doesn't quite pass Eleanor Roosevelt. So she really resonates here, she really does. Which isn't such a bad thing, I mean, she did a lot. She really did a lot, especially coming out of that family. That helps too, but she was her own person. She helps to become her own person as she's growing up.
Are you contemplating a talk on Vladimir?
If they want me to. They want me to. Yeah, there's a whole lot going on with that guy. And he's only going to be 65 next month. So he doesn't look 65, and he looks like he's going to be around quite a while, Mr. Putin.
Is he going to get Social Security?
He'll arrange it on his own. He'll talk to some of his oligarch friends and say, yes, I'm getting ready to pack it in. I want this amount. So, no, he's a fascinating character. He really is. Despite the fact he's a thug, but he's fascinating. Stalin light, as I like to call him. So next week is Helen Keller. She is a poster child expression of somebody who has an impairment. Let's put it this way. More than one impairment, and yet look at the mark she left on the world. Yep. Interesting lady. And for quite a bit of her years was from Connecticut. So,
Thank you.
you're welcome. Have a good evening.